Remember those who are in chains as if you were in chains with them. Hebrews 13:3. The United States has the largest prison population in the world. According to the World Prison Brief, the United States currently houses 2,121,600 inmates. There are more people in prisons than colleges and universities. 13 million Americans are arrested yearly. Those arrested are not convicted in the United States judicial systems until years later. Meanwhile, those Americans have now become prisoners without being convicted of a crime. Statistically, those arrested will go to a private prison. The largest private prison company is the CCA, Correction Corporations of America. Other private prison groups are the GEO Group and CoreCivic. Between 1970 to 2005, the U.S. prison population increased by 700%. Growth has been funded by needless, lengthy sentences and putting countless nonviolent offenders behind bars. This creates a huge profit for CCA, but no benefit for the general public. Privatized prisons are a huge influence to this massive number of prisoners, causing mass incarceration. Due to mass incarceration, prisoners accrue debt, endure frequent solitary confinement, are exposed to poor conditions, and prisons have shown a rise of violence. Mass incarceration leads to prisoners acquiring debt through the commissary, phone calls, fees, fines, and sometimes health care. Some prisons will let the prisoners take out a small loan for commissary items, which is nice because if the prisoner doesn't have money, then they will not be able to buy extra food. Prisoners have to purchase undershirts and shoes. Fees expected to be paid by the prisoner include court fees, court-appointed attorney fees, jury fees, DNA database fees, and incarceration costs. These incarceration costs are charges for a cell and basic food. If a prisoner has a major surgery, they will have to take out a loan for the cost of the procedure. All of these small debts add up to be paid once the prisoner is released. Then the cost of the parole is added into the prisoner's running total. However, if the prisoner cannot afford to pay these fines, then they will be placed back into the prison. In return, private prisons make money for every bed that is filled, paid by the state and again by the prisoner's fees. There are work-related opportunities for the prisoner to perform work duties in return for minimum payment. The payment averaged to be 35 cents an hour. Prisoners are happy to get that if they do not have help from family or friends. There are 1 million Americans working for corporations in prisons. In addition to acquiring debt, prisoners also have to endure frequent and lengthy solitary confinement. Originally, the purpose of solitary confinement was to separate violent offenders from the general population. Currently, half of the prison population have not committed violent crimes. So, according to the small number of violent convicts, solitary confinement should rarely be used, but that is not the case. It is often used as a force of discipline and more often used as a way to have control over the prisoner. In overcrowded private prisons, correction officers need to show dominance over the inmates, meaning that solitary stays for small infractions. Over 81,000 prisoners are held in isolation. Solitary confinement is typically a 60 by 80 cell with a toilet, cot, and sink. Prisoners are kept in that room for 23 hours a day, and some are released for 1 hour. This amount of isolation can lead to numerous psychological problems. 95% of Americans in solitary confinement report psychotic conditions such as paranoia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal thoughts. Also, prisoners are 5 times more likely to commit suicide in solitary confinement. Anthony Grace is an example of an extended solitary confinement stay. He spent 16 years in solitary confinement after being wrongfully convicted for murder. Another example is Khalif Browder, whom spent 700 days in solitary confinement as a use of punishment. In an interview, he stated that the correction officers told him that solitary will break him. The last example, and least used by prisons, is solitary confinement for protection of the prisoner. Timothy Gentry, Summer Andrews' father, was placed in solitary confinement after being attacked by a group of prisoners. They attempted to cut out his eye with a razor blade. After his surgery, he was placed in solitary confinement for the next 2 years. If we have the ability to arrest, convict, and incarcerate one of our citizens, then where is the responsibility for taking proper care of that individual? Prisoners are exposed to inhumane conditions in privatized prisons. Although prisoners do have health care, the care they receive actually varies from prison to prison. In 2017, Idaho Correctional Institute faces a lawsuit from their inmates from the gruesome health care they had to suffer through. Prisoners were forced to undergo amputations after their blisters and bed sores went untreated. These prisoners were left without food and water for extended periods of time. The death rate outpaced the national average. After winning the class action lawsuit that was originally started in 1981, the prison is still struggling to meet the basic medical stipulations from their agreement. Officers in private prisons are not equipped to properly treat mental illnesses. A person is 16 times more likely to die when encountering law enforcement if they have a mental illness. If they do not die, they are 10 times more likely to end up in a prison rather than a psychiatric facility. Another example of poor conditions is the lack of food. So, food is provided while you are incarcerated. However, on the weekends, it is assumed that family and friends will visit. Prisoners will only be served one meal on the weekends. In addition to this, most prisons lack air conditioning during the summer. Especially in privatized prisons that run a profit, air conditioning is a luxury, therefore prisons do not get it. Lastly, privatized prisons hold so many prisoners that there has been a rise of violence in prisons. 1 out of every 5 inmates are attacked each month. 1 out of every 10 inmates are raped. In privatized prisons, their budget does not include enough correctional officers per prisoner. Safety per prisoners and guards is compromised. For every 100 prisoners, there is only 1 guard. Some guards choose not to interfere in an altercation. For example, in Idaho Correctional Institute, January 2010, Hani Elbeded was attacked by a fellow inmate. He managed to approach the guard station and beat on the glass, pleading for help. Guards looked up but chose not to help. One even stood in the doorway during some of the beating to get a better view, but did not intervene. Hani's beating left him with permanent brain damage, later causing his death in 2012. Inmates claimed this prison was gladiator school. Another instance was Khalif Browder, 16-year-old, wrongfully convicted for stealing a backpack. He was placed in Rikers Island for the 3 years it took him to overturn the charges against him. Khalif was repeatedly beaten by guards and prisoners. He was tortured and starved. After his release in 2013, Khalif Browder suffered from paranoia and PTSD, leading to his suicide. Unfortunately, prisoners are not the only ones causing harm. In Nashville, Tennessee, 2006, Estelle Richardson was found unresponsive in her solitary confinement cell. Estelle had a fractured skull and several broken ribs. The only people accessible to her cell was the 4 guards on duty. Even though they were charged with her murder, the CCA had the charges dropped due to the lack of evidence. The only video camera recording the Estelle's cell was turned off that day. Prisoners need more protection than what privatized prisons will give them. Their budgets are based on pleasing their shareholders, not the well-being of the prisoners. Mass incarceration causes arrears for prisoners, extended isolation, gruesome prison conditions, and an incline of assaults. In the 2010 annual report to shareholders, CCA stated, the demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted, and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. Therefore, reduced sentences, changes with non-chemically enhanced drugs becoming legal, and immigrants allowed to become citizens will put privatized prisons out of business. Privatized prisons cannot allow this to happen, so they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on elections and campaigns for state legislators, governors, and judges. Between 2002 and 2012, the CCA, GEO, and Management Training Corporation spent $45 million on stated and federal lobbyists. Between 2003 and 2011, CCA hired 199 lobbyists in 32 states and contributed to over 600 candidates for state officials. This means that governors, senators, judges are being influenced on laws passed, the number of required arrests, the length of sentences, A 2013 report in the Republic Resource Center revealed some companies have been signing contracts with states that contain clauses guaranteeing high prison occupancy rates. Some contracts require 90 to 100% occupancy. Therefore, if the prison in question are not filled to required occupancy, either the state has to find more people to fill the prisons or pay the company for the unused beds. The Mid-Atlantic Youth Services Corporations, Pennsylvania Child Care, and Western Pennsylvania Child Care had to bribe officials to get beds in their facilities filled. In August 2011, former Lucin County Judge Mark Siviera Jr. was sentenced to 28 years in prison after sending children to detention centers owned by the companies in exchange for taking over $1 million in bribes. Privatized prisons should be closed because they purposefully create mass incarceration to raise a profit. They only make money when a person is incarcerated. Americans' tax dollars are used on a facility where corporate greed is more important than accountability and safety. Currently, the FBI is investigating CCA for falsifying 4,800 hours of guards posts required under Idaho contract. CCA was collecting payments from the states for guards who were never assigned to work. These privatized prisons in Idaho assume 4 times the prisoner-on-prisoner assaults than the state's 7 other prisons combined. The Idaho's Department of Corrections identified inadequate staffing as a primary cause of violence. Finally, there are multiple reasons why people may get arrested by officers. Finally, there are multiple reasons why police officers may arrest people. Due to the extremely high prison rates, a person is more likely to get arrested here than anywhere else in the world. For example, in 1975, Bruce Lisker found his mother stabbed in her home. He called 911 for help, but the police officer handcuffed him upon arrival. They did not let him go to the hospital with his mother. He was interrogated while his mother died in the hospital. Bruce was charged for her murder and found guilty with fabricated evidence. After Bruce's father passed away, Bruce was able to hire a private investigator with his inheritance. The investigator found the true killer and proof of the fabricated evidence. This new evidence was presented to a judge but was denied. This investigator then gave everything to the New York Times and published an article for Bruce. The Times won a Pulitzer and several other awards with this article. This article was the only reason that the public got to see the real truth behind Bruce's conviction, and Bruce was set free. He spent 22 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. False imprisonment happens to people every day. The average person commits 2 felonies a day without even realizing it. Every American should know what to do when confronted by a police officer, more specifically, an agitated police officer. Always be polite to law enforcement. The process will be smoother. Never engage in physical contact with an officer. Always ask, am I being detained? If the person in question is not being detained, leave immediately. If the person in question is being detained, know that the police can legally lie as a tactic. As an American, be aware of the rights that are provided and try to stay out of the judicial system. Hopefully, privatized prisons will soon be shut down, so no one else will have to endure such horrible conditions that these prisons are not willing to pay for.